Back live tonight here on In Focus, and thanks for staying on. The appointment of Johannesburg Property Company board members has had tongues wagging throughout the weekend and pretty much a large part of today. A tollgate cashier, a receptionist and a person with a grade 11 are among those who made the cut to oversee the city's 30,000 buildings. The DA's Marais is joining me for that conversation. Andrew, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time and coming on In Focus this evening. How did this happen? The receptionist, a cashier, and a person with a grade 11 on the board.
Well, good evening, and good evening to your listeners. It's really due to the way the processes work to appoint board members in Johannesburg. How that operates is a panel is first of all, applications are called for. The notice which calls for applications specifically says that the people who apply should have qualifications and experience which is relevant to the particular entity in respect of which they're applying for positions. But despite that, of course, there are many people who put in applications who don't really have the requisite skills. What happens then is once all the applications come in and are checked, they are then presented to a panel. That panel consists of the MMC, the MMC is a member of the mayoral committee who is responsible for the joint services in Johannesburg. Joint services also include the human resources function, which is why that particular MMC always sits on these boards. The second person who sits on these panels to select the boards, the second MMC who sits on the panel is the MMC who is the MMC who has oversight over the particular entity.
Yeah.
And then finally, the third member of that panel is the city manager. So the problem is that only those three people actually decide upon who the candidate should be. That is who the people selected to become board members should be. And it doesn't go back to the council. The decision, in fact, is made by those three people. And this is really the problem.
So it's the city manager, it's the MMC, and you said the third person would be?
It's the MMC who has oversight over the particular entity. So, for instance, with the Joburg Property Company, the JPC, that MMC is the MMC for Economic Development,
right,
who is Councillor Nisi. And then the other MMC is the MMC for Joint Services in the city of Johannesburg. The reason why that MMC is in that position is because that MMC is charged with oversight over human resources.
Right.
And obviously, one of the things you've got to look at when you are thinking of appointing somebody are sort of matters which are relevant to the human resources space.
I see. Who's that MMC?
That's a good question. I can't remember offhand. I'd have to. I can't remember offhand. So if I told you who it was, I'd be making an error.
Yeah. And do you believe that MMC for Economic Development would have veto power in comparison to those other two, including the municipal manager, on who makes it to the board?
Well, no, not necessarily. Look, what's supposed to happen is the three members of that panel are supposed to decide together. And in fact, generally speaking, I think consensus does operate. And depending on the relative, obviously one of the problems is you have two politicians sitting on that panel of three members. So there is a strong political bias on already sort of built into the selection process. So that is a problem. But it doesn't necessarily follow that the MMC for the particular entity will necessarily dominate the proceeding or push his or her favored candidates.
Yeah. So I mean, the MMC could say, well, look, it's an open process. Do they meet the criteria and specs of that particular position? Were they allowed to apply, and they were allowed to apply, and therefore, why wouldn't they be appointed?
Well, the answer is that there's nothing which stops them being appointed. The problem is that, as you will know, and I'm sure many of the listeners know, the function of a board of directors is to exercise oversight over the activities of the particular entity to which that board of directors relates. In this particular case, of course, it's the JPC. So that means that the people who sit on that board must have relevant knowledge and skills to be able to exercise proper oversight over that particular entity. And this is really where the problem lies, that if you just appoint people without really concerning yourself with their particular skill sets, you get a problem, because it means that proper oversight is not exercised over the particular entity.
And are you going to be challenging then, therefore, these appointments?
Well, we're looking into it. There are various things. First of all, we have to establish the basis upon which the particular persons were appointed, which means that we will have to ask questions and call for the particular reports and so on upon which the panel relied to make the appointment. So that's one of the things we've already started. And we have a system in council where we can ask questions of the various MMCs. So that has been launched. As far as other processes are concerned, there is a possibility that they could be challenged legally in the courts. We haven't looked into that at this stage, but it might be something we'd consider doing.
Let's also bring into the conversation now Nobuhle of Action SA with the Joburg caucus there, leading that caucus. Nobuhle, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. You have welcomed the referral of the MMC for Economic Development to the Ethics Committee. What is that relating to?
Thank you, Thabo, and good evening to your viewers at home. Remember, on the first week of August, we got information about misconduct that was done by MMC Nomoya Mnisi. Then we went to the Hillbrow police station to open criminal corruption charges so that the law can investigate if there's any basis to those claims. And what other step we took as councillors in the city of Joburg is to follow the process that has been put in place, and that's to refer a councillor that is accused of misconduct to the Ethics and Disciplinary Committee. We wrote to the Speaker of Council, Councillor Colleen Makubele. She sat down with the legal team, and based on the evidence that we submitted, they saw it fit to refer her to the Ethics and Disciplinary Committee so that the Ethics and Disciplinary Committee can call her to speak for herself and interview all the affected parties so they can see if really did she do this or it's just allegations that have no basis. So we are happy about that, and we are pleading for the Ethics and Disciplinary Committee to speed up the process, because this matter is quite urgent and the MMC is still occupying her position. And we are worried as Action SA that she might abuse her position of power to the affected officials, and that most of them would withdraw and not even make it to that Ethics and Disciplinary Committee's meeting.
Yeah, so we had Finance MMC Dara Morero here with us the other time. He's also the chairperson of the ANC, I suppose, in the Joburg region. And we asked him that question about this particular request for sponsoring the ANC Youth League Conference. He says, well, I mean, I also received that request, and she would have sent it to a number of business people, a number of people that she would have believed that would have been able to make a contribution. But that is not to say she had any influence in the decision that would have been taken into making that contribution. So what evidence are you presenting to the Ethics Committee in that regard?
Look, Thabo, the acting CFO at that time, Mr. Sipho Mzobe, wrote an internal memo, and he also submitted communication between himself and the MMC after he submitted that internal memo, and the SMSs he received from the MMC threatening him, telling him to withdraw the statements. So we have that information that we submitted as part of the evidence. And to be quite honest, Dada Moremo, MMC Dada Moremo, is the caucus leader for the African National Congress. That is Nomoya's boss. And I don't think she'll say anything negative because she knows that she still needs to present herself to the ethics committee. And it does not make sense that an MMC for economic development will want to use a position of power to tap into the city's coffers for something that's not even related to the city, but to enrich her position in the ANC Youth League. If we recall or remember correctly, she was the treasurer of the ANC Youth League at the time that they were going to the conference. So MMC Dada Morero will not say this outright. He'll just wait for her to go and present her case to the Ethics and Disciplinary Committee.
Yeah, and you would be willing to abide by the outcomes of that process?
For sure, we'll do that. We trust them. We know these are our colleagues and we know they are ethical. And we even know that there's legal people in that committee. So as councillors in the city of Johannesburg, we are sure that we've got people who still uphold the integrity of the city, who make sure that if the MMC is guilty in this alleged corruption charges, that she's held accountable.
And back to you, Mr. Andrew, I mean, the question that of course, arises here is whether or not there is something wrong with the criteria that is used in appointing people to boards of state entities. I mean, there is a whole handbook around this that would outline how people are appointed and so on and so forth, and whether that is where the problem is and that is what would need to be changed.
When it comes to
sorry, Nobuhle, I'm coming back to you. It's for Andrew, this one. Go for it.
Okay.
Right, yes. Look, if one looks at the particular guidelines and so on, it does make it quite plain that the people who are appointed to boards should have skills which are relevant to the area in which the particular entity operates. So I think it's actually fairly clear from the guidelines what is required. And also, if as I mentioned, the application, the notices which the city puts out asking for applicants to apply is also pretty clear as to the sort of qualities which an applicant should have. So I don't think that's really where the problem lies. The problem really lies in the process which is followed internally by the city of Johannesburg in appointing board members. I already touched on the fact that it's only the panel of 3 members who actually is involved in making that decision. And that, to my mind, is a problem in itself, because if one has regard to the municipal legislation, my own views, the thrust of the municipal legislation, although it doesn't say it explicitly, is that the people who are appointed to the board should actually be representatives of the council. So that's the whole council, all the councillors sitting in a meeting who should really be represented on the boards of the entities.
Right.
So it shouldn't really be a decision only of the executive.
Right. So the broader council is not involved at all. For example, in the shortlisting, maybe you shortlist and you get down to a particular number, then hand over to the 3 to then make the final decision. So they're not involved at all.
No, they're not at all.
So from
and it's quite yes.
I'm saying from the whole point of application. So it's only those 3 that would look at the CVs, that would shortlist, and that would end up actually appointing who goes onto those boards.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, that would be a big issue, I suppose, especially if you are dealing with issues of conflict of interest and people having relationships with people on those boards. Is there a way of remedying that?
Well, I think the one way, of course, which I touched on, is that it should be the council should be, as a whole, should be involved in the final decision. Rather similar to the process which is followed in regard to the appointment of senior managers. The process which is followed for the appointment of senior managers, while there's the initial part of the sifting process and so on, is done by officials and so on. The final step, once the recommendations are made, I should mention the executive is also involved, but the final step is that the recommendations come up to council, and it's only if council then approves those recommendations that those senior managers are in fact appointed. And my view is that a similar approach should be adopted in regard to members of the boards of the entities.
Yeah. Nobuhle, yourself, what do you make of the process of appointing people to official positions at state entities and how it's managed?
Look, Thabo, it's interesting times, but remember, even the mayor of the city of Johannesburg doesn't even have a matric. So what more do we think of appointing board members in one of our entities? If the mayor himself doesn't have the right qualifications, then he has set the precedent. So that's why we are here now. That's why we are in this situation. We've set a wrong precedent as councillors or as people in the city of Johannesburg. It's quite bad and in bad taste.
Now, with relation to this process then that is undertaken now, you're saying the ball is in the court of the ethics committee and you would want them to finalize this as quickly as possible. What is as quickly as possible for you?
Look, I know the Ethics and Disciplinary Committee have other matters, but if we could see something happening maybe within the next 3 months, and the reason why I'm saying this is because ever since we opened those alleged corruption charges against MMC Nomoya Mnisi, every month something pops up. Last month it was MMC of Transport, Kenny Kunene, having a head-to-head with MMC Dada Morero over the same portfolio. This past Sunday, yesterday, it was about the board members. So there's something about this MMC every day. This is just a clear indication that there's something happening in economic development. Someone is putting their hands in the coffers of the city, and we cannot keep quiet. So this is a matter of agency. If we do not take this as serious as it is, then it shows that all the MMCs, all the executive won't be held accountable. Then how can the residents of the city of Johannesburg trust us also as councillors sitting in opposition benches?
Councillors in the city of Johannesburg, Andrew Marais and Nobuhle Mthembu, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on and for engaging with us there on this matter tonight.